Welcome everyone to this celebration of the long and happy life of Alan Lindley Beghold. I'm his daughter Lindley, and I'm going to start with the introduction. But first I want to thank Jerry DeBoren for organizing this and supporting the event, Susan Furtado, the department manager, for her masterful planning, and Christopher Geisler, the director of the John Hay Library, for creating an elegant and extensive exhibit of ALB's work. I hope you'll all go down afterwards across the street, entering by the side to go see some of the vitrines that have some of his work in them. So that takes care of the technicalities, and now I want to just share a recollection of Dad when we overlapped at Brown in 1976. I was taking Arnold Weinstein's brutal and brilliant course in Proust, Joyce, and Faulkner, and I'd written a paper I wanted to run by Dad. So I went to his office in the old Classics building. You probably remember it, stacked high with off-prints, smelled like a library, with the Make Love Not War poster featuring two rhinoceri on the floor wall by the window. And so I sat down and I read him a passage, and in it I compared a passage in Proust's Cities of the Plain to a sponge sugar bridge over a septic tank. And Dad said, "No, that's got to go." And I said, "Dad, it's my favorite part." And he said, "Well, first of all, you have to know that a septic tank is a closed system, so it doesn't need a bridge. And second, as you continue to write, you will find that that which you are most fond of should probably be excised." And fast forward, I went into a career in book publishing, and a week doesn't go by where I don't follow that advice in some way or another, and sometimes on weekends. I also had the pleasure later in my career of working with Dad on his 3 books of collected poetry. And while I did that, I realized how fiercely he held to that advice himself during what my husband John calls thousands of hours of quiet redacting. He mused, he moved, he excised, he added. And I think the result is a collection of poems that are as clear and thoughtful and interesting and multi-layered as any I've read. But I am obviously a little bit biased. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adele Scafuro, beloved friend and colleague, to take over the next part of the program.
Thank you, Lindley. I speak to you as a member of the Classics Department, as the person who currently is the longest working person in the Classics Department at Brown. I first met Alan Beghold in 1983 in a hotel room when I was being interviewed for the job along with 4 other of his colleagues. I had to be pushed into the room because I was so nervous. And I sat there before these distinguished men trying to, be okay, and Alan Beghold fell asleep. I don't know, maybe that made me think I had to be more interesting to get the job, and I did get the job, and Alan became my best friend and colleague for the next 33 years and more after he retired. So that was our beginning, and I miss him very much, as you can imagine, as being a person who's been a lifelong, a very, very long friend of mine. Now, I want to introduce our first speaker, a friend of Alan's for very many years, Ed Cohn, a distinguished man who has both a law degree and a classics degree, who taught a stint of classics at Princeton, who manages to write books on classics and also to have a career as a lawyer and able to support wonderful institutions such as the American School of Classical Studies, for which we are all so grateful. Thank you, Ed.
I think they've constructed this place so that people of my age have something to hold on to. But, celebrating Alan Beghold is very easy. For he was, in the words of the editors, and I see at least one is here, of the Festschrift, celebrating his 75th birthday, the words they used were, quote, an inspirational teacher, a wonderful human being, and without peer in the life of the mind, end quote. I knew and admired Alan for more than 2.5 decades, and I was able to voice similar laudatory sentiments several years ago when I was given the opportunity to recognize Alan as the best of the best in presenting to him the highly esteemed Aristea Award, the best award of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And yet, my memories of Alan focus on pedestrian images of walls. For example, the ruined walls of ancient Athenian buildings, which were set forth in figures 1 to 10 of his great work of scholarship, the Athenian Agora, volume 28, the law courts at Athens. Those of us who work in ancient law always were indebted to Alan because he laid out with clarity those things that the rest of us spent our time obfuscating. And then there was his translation of Walls, Tychi. It's the opening poem in Alan's enormously moving but uncannily accurate 166 poems, his 2008 translation of the modern Greek poet Kavafis. And you know, Lindley, I have read so many translations in so many languages of Kavafis' poems, but many of us think that no one was able to write with the empathy and the capturing of the essence of Kavafi that Alan was able to do so. Walls opens with, and I think this is typical, Alan writes, without regard, compassion, or shame, they built around me great high walls. Without my notice, they closed me from the world outside. And for the purists who are here, here's what Kavafi said. Choris peris skepsin, choris lipin, choris edo, megala kipsila trieromu ektisan tichi, anepestitos meklisan apoton kosmon exo. Those others who tried and sometimes failed can only envy the skill that Alan brought to dealing with walls in that context. But you all know that Alan's life was dedicated not to building walls, but to opening walls, demolishing barriers to insight, and encouraging the discouraged. I really doubt that this year, if God willing he were here, I doubt that he would be voting for the wall builder, even if Mexico agreed to fund a new Spanish language Loeb series. Now, I myself had run into a wall of scholarly rejection when I was preparing my book on Athenian banking. But Alan was almost alone, and Connie Ron Stroud was another one, in being open to the possibility of a 4th century Athens that, contrary to the then prevailing orthodoxy, actually had an economy. Walls. Some years later, in about 2009, I was walking down Park Avenue near my home in New York City when I encountered a wall of prominent neoconservatives blocking the sidewalk, headed by, it seemed to me, I thought I was delirious, headed by the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. And then, seemingly confirming that this was truly a fantasy, or some of you might think perhaps a nightmare, there appeared in the center of this miasma a familiar face, Professor Alan Beghold. Alan, I said, thinking I was in a dream, Alan, how can we wake up? And he said, no, Ed, you're not dreaming. This is real. All these guys are celebrating the life of one of theirs, who happened to have been one of my relatives, and that's why I'm here. Maybe they'll have some insights. he said, without rolling his eyes. And I thought, only Alan, or perhaps Socrates, would see a gathering of uncongenial ideology as a potential opportunity to learn. And then there was John Camp, who had built a wall, I don't say this critically, John, around his latest excavations involving the Stoa Poikile. Well, of course, he had to build the wall because the excavations were 90 feet below the surface and somebody could fall. But we were there in Athens at that time. By then, Alan was well into his 80s, less steady on his feet than he had been, but determined to descend the full 30 meters via a rickety staircase to learn for himself what the ruined walls below would teach. Now, Alan knew that I was an acrophobe. Psychologically, I was standing there at the top struggling to gain the courage to walk down those rickety stairs and courage to descend. But when Alan realized my difficulty, disregarding his own fragility, he encouraged me, saying, "There's a lot to learn. And Ed, don't worry about the descent. You can lean on me." You know, we all leaned on Alan Beghold for a long time. Thank you, Alan.
Our next speaker is Connie Stroud. Ron couldn't make it today. We all know Ron Stroud, and we all love him as a wonderful teacher, epigraphist, and friend, and we are just so happy that Connie is here to deliver Ron's words.
Ron asked me to tell you that he is very sad not to be here, and I'm reading his words. Alan and I first met in ancient Corinth almost exactly 56 years ago in May of 1960. We were excavating side by side in the western end of the Forum under the direction of Henry Robinson. Alan had been sent to Corinth as a representative of Brown University by his chairman, Charles Alexander Robinson. I was digging for the American School. Our finds were not impressive: coarse Byzantine and Frankish pottery, a few late Roman coins. But we shared a room in the excavation house. This is the one that later burned down. And we spent the evenings talking about the syntax of Thucydides, Greek inscriptions, our old teachers, Pritchett and Dow, and Michael Jameson's Themistocles Decree, which had just been found. I also asked Alan about his wife and family, and he produced a striking photograph of his young son, David, sitting on the ground in short pants, intently focusing on a small object that he held in both hands. I was told to go like this and show you with both hands. This was total concentration. When I asked what he was looking at, Alan replied, "Probably something he picked out of his nose." Hello. Our friendship went on for more than half a century in Athens, Berkeley, Providence, Great Neck, Deepest Monte, in a howling storm, and Mount Olympus, but not quite all the way to the top. After we had not seen each other for several years, we almost immediately picked up our conversations where we had last left off. In summoning up our friendship in recent days, I keep thinking again and again of my favorite Beghold poem. It is entitled Sirrah, August 1974. In the evening, the poet hears a donkey braying, or as Alan puts it, screaming to his pasture, we ask the owner why. The owner offers an interpretation. Flepi tus filus keponai. He sees his friends and he hurts. Then the poet asks, and I quote, tough, paradoxical donkey, final test of thistles and bits. Must friendship hurt? Be bittersweet even for him? Or did I not understand? In the end, donkey, owner, and poet all really do understand and agree that friendship can often hurt. Memories, too, can sometimes hurt. But this is not the kind of memory that I take away from my long friendship with this wonderful man.
And now I'm introducing Bill Allman, a friend, colleague, and squash partner. Bill?
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Lindley and Julie, for letting me speak today. You know, Alan is known to many of us in so many different ways. He was a great scholar, a professor, an author, an expert in all things classical. And I greatly admire him for all these remarkable achievements. But I didn't really experience them firsthand, and so I'll leave it to the others today to recount and celebrate. I'm here to talk about Alan and beer. You see, my introduction to Alan came through none of the usual ways a young man at Brown University would have typically met him. That is, through the halls of academia, a lecture series, or as an advisor. I met him because I was dating his daughter. When we first met, I don't believe that Alan spent a single minute sizing me up as a future son-in-law. Rather, he saw this new development as he regarded so much of his life, an opportunity to have fun. And thus, before the word was ever coined, a bromance was born. He wasn't so much my potential father-in-law as the older brother I never had. We played game after game after game of squash before our classes in the early morning. We played game after game of tennis on the weekends. He challenged me to one-arm push-ups, and he won. We canoed on the river and chopped wood for the fireplace. For an egghead, he was a remarkable athlete, surprisingly graceful and fiercely tenacious. We also did brain games. He was a treasure trove of hilarious jokes, none of which are suitable to repeat today. I was a fledgling poet, and he graciously treated my doggerel with gusto. And in this non-academic way, he was a great teacher. We talked Shakespeare, modern fiction. He introduced me to opera on Sunday afternoons on public radio. He taught me how to open oysters that we gathered on the Slocum River. Alan was always up to a challenge. Once when I, who was raised in the Midwest, said, "What is this New England clam bake anyway?" He responded with, as our friend John Milkey would put it, the full bigness. I'm not 100% sure if he'd ever done one before, but he proceeded to create the mother of all New England clam bakes. He dug a giant pit in front of the lawn at Great Neck. He lined it with rocks. He put in huge burning logs. He harvested seaweed. He layered on the food and spread an enormous tarp. And the whole thing, the whole shebang. And it turned out magically, terrifically wondrous. And through it all, I kept grinning, and that wonderful Alan Baghold grin, loving every second of the adventure and knowing that he'd give the challenge everything he had. Which brings us to the beer. One weekend, we went to visit Julie's parents in Cornwall and Hudson, and the night we arrived after dinner, Alan and I started talking and drinking a few beers, some Heinekens. And we talked some more and drank a few more beers, and then a few more, and then suddenly there was no more beer. So Julie's father, a wonderful man with impeccable manners, never said a word about us depleting his entire larder of the pricey lager. Instead, he returned from shopping the next morning with another case of beer. This time it was 16-ounce cans of the low-priced Schlitz. Witnessing this subtle chastisement, Alan looked at me and eyed him, and we decided to take up the challenge. I don't remember whether we actually finished the entire case, because I don't remember much about that weekend at all. But I do remember that we had a lot of fun trying. This indomitable spirit is what I remember most about Alan. You may recall the famous mullet haircut from the 80s that the Bee Gees did. It's short on the top and it fell back in the shoulders. And they used to say about this hairstyle, it was all business in the front and all party in the back. And I would submit that Alan was a quintessentially Greek version of this concept. Throughout his whole life, Alan was all Athens in the front, soft-spoken, thoughtful, intellectual. But as I can attest, in the back, Alan was all Sparta. Behind that kind demeanor, whimsical smile lurked a great warrior, fierce competitor, tireless adventurer, and for a young man like me at the time, and many of us still, a great inspiration.
Now, Jenny Scott, member of 12th Night Club, and a dear friend over the years.
Thank you, Julie, and everybody in the Bakewell family for asking me to take part in the celebration of Alan's life. I speak to you as a longtime friend of Alan. Like others in the congregation, I played tennis with Alan, and my colleague down here I know has played a lot of games. One day, he announced he'd turned 70. I, at the time, was in my mid-50s. I thought, one, you really don't look 70. And two, how on earth do you play at such a level at that great age? In 2004, Tom Adams, the former director of the John Carter Brown Library here at Brown, and I urged Alan to join a men's lunch group called the 12th Night Club. The group's stated purpose is that it has none, other than enjoying the fellowship and many good stories. Alan regularly shared stories with the group, some from his knowledge of Greek antiquity, others from more contemporary times. A few were serious, many were hilarious. His advancing neurological illness required that he resign in 2012. The members of the 12th Night Group miss him very much and ask that I extend their condolence to everyone here. Switching gears, I must mention my brother-in-law, Jim Ottaway, another longtime friend of Alan. Jim, a newspaper publisher and journalist, met Alan many years ago at the American School for Classical Studies in Athens and shared many digs with Alan. He wrote me, and I think some of the planners of the ceremony today, that he really wished he could be here with us all, but he had another commitment in Europe and sends his regrets. Alan had a long, rich life. As I was thinking about what to say today, Konstantin Cavafy's poem, Ithaca, came to mind. And here it is on the program. I can think of nothing that more beautifully talks about a journey in life and how reflective this is of Alan's life. Thank you.
Yes, and I thought I'd say a little something about the piece and how it relates to Alan. Well, I always thought of Alan as kind of a man of the world who I looked up to. I was always particularly enjoyed his recollections of his early life in the Midwest. And in order to pay homage to that, I thought I would play you something today by a fellow Midwesterner, a guy named John William Blind Boone, who is one of the forgotten figures in early American music. And actually, as we sit here today, Blind Boone's house that was in derelict and abandoned condition until recently is being dedicated and opened up as a museum. And I thought that Alan, I'd like to think that he would have liked me telling him all about this, and particularly the house in the intervening years since Boone's death in 1927. The house was used as a whorehouse and as a funeral parlor.
Our next speaker is George Huxley, who comes to us from Oxford. George has a long career behind him of teaching at Trinity College in Dublin and also a close connection to the American School as director of the Gennadian Library from 1986 to 1989, and a dear old friend of Alan's.
It was very kind of Julie to invite me to be here today. Julie and Alan became friends of Davina and me 60 years ago. I at once admired the grace of Julie and the serenity of Alan, and from the beginning, in conversations at Athens, there was respect for Alan's use of words, in speech, in his scholarly prose, in his letter writing, and later in his poetry. He was indeed a superb wordsmith. Memory preserves an early conversation, for example, about the difference between influence and impact, and possible reasons for the increased use of the latter word. In speech and writing, the style was the man. He was precise, but not pedantic, lean, but not laconic. Yet I think that in his manner of scholarly exposition, he owed something to Professor Dow, his Harvard mentor, who showed how to interpret archaeological evidence historically. The combination of text and artifact is, for instance, effectively deployed in his book on the antiquities of the Attic law courts. In textual criticism and in epigraphy, he was always an alert practitioner. It was Alan who first detected the letter Sampe lurking on the Nessos amphora. The success of his pioneering work on gestures was due not only to his study of human conduct, but also to his exact reading of literary testimonies. The move to Providence was never regretted. Here family life flourished, and his life of the mind prospered in the company of congenial colleagues. He was fond of Providence itself, as I learnt during walks with him. I recall our talking about transits of Venus on Transit Street and the use of Esquire on lawyers' brass doorplates. He was the most tolerant of men, a tolerance sometimes tested when he was chairman of the managing committee of the American School at Athens. Yet he could be sharp when provoked by ignorance. I once heard him say that somebody was innocent of any formal knowledge. Over 6 decades, we saw the Bagehotels in the Englands, new and old, and in Greece, but alas, never in Ireland. I think he would have liked Ireland. We saw them too rarely, but friendship was kept in good repair by the writing of letters and by comments upon exchanged reprints. He had a large box file simply marked Huxley in the classics department. Alan loved the Greek countryside. He was especially fond of the Western Peloponnese. A delightful poem, deft in its observation of nature, has the title Spring Night at Neochori. Yet I think that he was most at home at Great Neck. There he and Julia, with David nearby, could walk, rest, and contemplate, and their scholarship continued almost to the end. Finally, with the help of a devoted amanuensis. He was no adherent of organized religion, but he understood Greek polytheism. He could explain, for instance, precisely how baby Hermes was economical with the truth after the theft of Apollo's cattle in the Homeric hymn. In his beautiful book of translated poems of Cavafy, his use of plain language, his attunement to character, made clear in the introduction, his tact in erotic exegesis, and his concept, shared with the poet, of a generously wide Hellenism, are all triumphantly brought together. There is something of Allen himself in his rendering of the tomb of the grammarian Lysias, who was buried in the library at Beirut. We put him close to the things he may remember even there: commentaries, texts and grammars, documents, a lot of interpretation in fascicules of Hellenism. Istevki Ellenismon, Poly Erminia. Allen was always an understanding interpreter of Hellenisms, indeed, but also friendships and the life of devotion to the Muses. For his constant understanding, our gratitude will endure. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jim Sickinger, but before I ask him to come up here, stay right where you are, Jim. Both Jim, a PhD of ours in 1992, and another PhD of ours, Jeff Bakewell, were responsible for the Festschrift for Allen. Jeff, unfortunately, was unable to come today. He's not well, and he sent a note and asked that it be read, and so I'm going to read it to us right now. Alan Lindley Baghold was for me both mentor and mensch. Some of my fondest memories stem from his office in McFarlane House, where he would lean back in his chair, fold his hands, play with his thumbs, and look over his glasses at me as we discussed Horace and Juvenal. Others come from sitting together on his dock in Massachusetts, eating fresh oysters, and talking about Aeschylus's Persians. And still others are lodged in a taverna perched on the southern slope of Lykopitas, where he welcomed my wife Rosie into our lifelong friendship over wine and octopus. At this point, I'll ask Jim to come up. And Jim, as I said, is a PhD student of Allen's. Allen wrote, I think one of his most well-known articles was the article on archives in 1972, AJA, and it's still cited today. And one reason perhaps for its fame is that it's also been given more fame by Jim Sickinger, who followed in his footsteps and wrote a book on the public archives in Athens, following upon his dissertation. So Jim.
Let me thank Adele and the family for the opportunity to speak here today. One of my earliest and most endearing memories of Allen comes from about 29 years ago, almost to the day. The spring term had ended, students had gone home, and I had just returned to Brown after a weekend in Connecticut, spending time with my brothers and college friends. I also returned black-eyed and bruised after a weekend of carousing, although the official story was that I had fallen off my bike. Allen, of course, took one look at me, saw through the charade, And Riley commented that he too could remember a time when he thought that his fists were faster than his feet. Now, that was a very special time to be at Brown with a faculty that included Charlie Siegel, Michael Putnam, Kurt Rafflaub, Charles Fornara, and Bill Wyatt. Adele was on leave for much of my time here, but David Constan joined just after a year or two. And then there was Professor Baghold, quiet, unassuming, and something of a mystery. I knew little of him other than that he worked on Greek things and that he had spent some time in Greece. But I ended up taking several classes with him, writing my dissertation under his direction, and then enjoying his mentorship and eventually friendship for the rest of my career. I'm not convinced, Adele, that he was sleeping during your interview, because we often wondered in seminars when he closed his eyes whether he was sleeping. But then, as we concluded, he would come up with the most penetrating question on an obscure part of our presentation just to keep us on our feet. The most memorable class that I took with him was on Greek epigraphy, in which Alan's own teacher, Sterling Dow, once came down to Providence to give a presentation, which he concluded by reminding us all that anyone who did not spend all his time studying Attic inscriptions ought to have his head examined. Now, Professor Dow's presence typifies an aspect of Alan's teaching, which is a constant reminder that we stood on the shoulders of giants, and that what we did was never new, but always built on the generation that came before us. Another lesson, though, and a greater testimony to Alan's skills as a teacher, is that all but one of the participants in that seminar went on to publish his or her research paper in some of the leading journals of classical studies. Nowadays, we urge our graduate students to publish their first articles, to get their research out there. But in this case, the publication arose not out of ambition or some push by Alan to get our names out there in print, but from his encouragement, his enthusiasm, and his gentle prodding to pursue good ideas to their natural conclusions. That quiet enthusiasm and encouragement also extended beyond the classroom. When I asked Alan what I could do to learn more about Greek epigraphy after that term, his answer was twofold. Read Euripides, he said, or perhaps it was Sophocles. I can't remember. I used to think that the response was a prod simply to learn Greek better, but since then, I've sometimes wondered whether his answer to many of life's questions was to read poetry, or better yet, to compose it. Second, he urged me to get myself to Greece and to the American school. And there are lots of stories that I and others can tell about the shared times we had there, but one moment stands out in my memory, a breakfast meal in Loring Hall, during which I regularly referred to him as Professor Baghold. Now, Alan was never one to put on airs, and afterwards he pulled me aside to remind me that at the school, everyone was on a first-name basis. All its members were students, and the positions and titles of the American university system had no place at the school. And to which I sheepishly replied, "I'll be sure to remember that, Professor Baghold." But that was one of Alan's secrets as a teacher, and it was no secret that he regarded his students as his peers and his equals. I'll conclude by observing that I also had the pleasure of getting to know both Alan and Julie better as a tenant from a year's stint when I lived as an underemployed recent PhD in their third-floor attic apartment at 38 Barnes Street. One reached this lofty penthouse through a back stairway, and tenants had to pass through the main kitchen to get there, which often meant passing through as Alan and Julie had breakfast, lunch, or dinner, as they were reading the New York Times, or even entertaining guests. It was uncomfortable at first, but by the end of the year, I was sitting down to join them. I talked of career prospects and my failed romantic pursuits, and they of their family life and life beyond classics and the university. And it's there I learned that children are life's greatest joy. The loving spouse is rare and never to be taken for granted, and that with a little bit of work, a career and a family could go together. And I realize now as I look back that more than the comments on the papers, the lessons in the classroom, that Alan taught me best simply by how he lived his life. Thank you.
Mariko Wire? Lindsay?
So I'm going to stay a little bit away from the mic. I've been privileged to know Alan and Julie for more than 3 decades, and when I was at the Athenaeum, we became particularly close. And I want to share with you a story in that we were planning a little odyssey of our own at the Athenaeum, and so of course we thought Alan, the erudite classicist, would enlighten us about the facts. Little did I think that what I would discover with this little boy with twinkly blue eyes lurking inside the classicist who would throw himself head-on in our irreverent odyssey. For example, we brought in Circe with real little piglets in the Athenaeum Children's Department, and he was thrilled with that. And then he decided that it would be great to have a shadow box with a Minotaur, and my son was the Minotaur, and he shouted so loud that he had no voice for the week after. And Alan also came up with, it had to be wavy, the water, and we projected against the walls this watery landscape in our own little odyssey. And also he came up with some research about the music. But anyway, he took it as if this was the most serious thing, and we laughed so much about it. So that was one side that I truly delighted me in Alan, in that there was this very, very great intellectual person who had this boyish love of life. And the second instance that developed our relationship is that he loved poetry and I love poetry, and we belonged to the same poetry group. And for years, we met first at Edwin Honig's house, and then at my house. And we would all bring our poetry trepidantly. We were there with Henry Gould and Stuart Blazer, and sometimes others would join us. We were trepidantly because here we were pouring our guts, and Alan did too, and we would never know if Honig would come and shred our poetry with one word, including our ego, or bring us up to heaven by saying we had hit a vein. But during that time, Alan and I shared a lot of poetry together, and I chose a few short poems which I feel somehow speak about the things that I felt were part of the nature, Alan's nature. And one was his celebration of life and of the small pleasures of life. I liked that about Alan. And so this poem that he wrote in this book, Reflections, I think speaks to that. Do I have my glasses here? Yeah. It's called Lunch near Selvole. Tordo diavolo. Ah, what a treat! Down by a hunter's dowdy gun, tiny bones innocent under one's teeth, al fresco in Tuscany under a tree. Was that a flutter there in the sky? The ghost of a thrush may just have passed by. And he had this enthusiasm, for these little things in life. Another poem, and I'm not going to do it like in a logical way, because I never do, but something else that illustrates his nature. I think that his whole life, to me, was his celebration of a yes to life. And so this is a poem that he brought to life from Cavafy, and you've heard many, and Cavafy was a poet from my own hometown of Alexandria, but I think it symbolized Alan's yes to life. Che fece il gran rifiuto? To certain persons, there comes one day when they must say the one yes or the one no. He can promptly be seen, the man who has ready within him the yes. Saying it goes on to honor and trust. He who said no does not repent. If asked again, he would say again no, yet it continues to undo him, that no, for the rest of his life. Alan's was a yes. The second poem in Cavafy that he brought to life, and he really brought the emotion, speaks of the sensuous nature that I felt in Alan. He really lived that, sensitivity and sensuousness. It's called Come Back. Here are Alan's words. Come back again and take me. Sensation I love, come back and take me. Whenever body's remembering wakes and old desire runs through the blood again. Whenever lips and skin remember and hands sense they are touching again. Come back again and take me at night. Whenever lips and skin remember. I'm going to go back now to another book that he wrote. This is not a translation. What you look at life, you give to life. And I'm reading this poem because I think that Alan is present today. I believe he is very happy to be with all of us. And this is the middle of May, and this poem is entitled Middle of May by Alan. The vernal air is full of promise, seminal, sexy, dense with seed. Green, green grasses dotted with buttercups lie beside our ups and downs, under our feet gravel and sand, and firm that we are grounded. Then, by way of esker and swale, salt marsh and mossy trail, we wrest bull-briar thorns away and winch from toxic ivies. Slippery stones and sprawling roots tease my balance, syncopate the hard-won rhythm of my gait. Once I would have fallen if I hadn't had your hand. I love this poem. So, the last one that I will write, and I hope I haven't exceeded my 5 minutes, is a poem about angels. I believe that angels are always with us, and I believe that thankfully Alan was no angel, but I think he's with the angels now. So I'll end with this poem by Alan called Angels. Angels, out of mercy, do not heed our prayers. Accident may touch us, start and stop our tears. Never, however, do angels meddle. They only tell what has to be. Thank you.
I would like to introduce my niece, Mariko Wyrick, who will play a piece by Bach that was loved by my dad. Mariko Wyrick. Where should it go? In the front?
Ithaca. When you go out on the voyage to Ithaca, pray the way will be long, full of adventures, full of recognitions. Laestrygonians and Cyclopes, angry Poseidon, do not fear them. You will never find such things in your way if your view stays high, if a very special emotion touches your mind and body. Laestrygonians and Cyclopes, wild Poseidon, you won't meet them if you don't transport them into your soul, if your soul does not raise them before you. Pray the way will be long. Pray there be many summer mornings when you, how gratefully, how gladly, enter harbors you see for the first time, stop at Phoenician exchanges, acquire their fair worked pieces, and diamonds and coral, electrum and ebony, and voluptuous scents of every kind. Voluptuous scents, as many as you can. Go to many Egyptian cities, learn and learn from their scholars. Always keep Ithaca in your mind. Arrival there is your goal, but do not at all hurry the trip. Better years to get there. Then, when you are old, you will anchor at the island, rich with all you've gained on the way, not expecting Ithaca to give you wealth. Ithaca gave you a beautiful voyage. Without her, you would not have set out, but she cannot give you any more. And if you find her poor, Ithaca did not fool you. Wise as you have become, so expert by then, you will know what an Ithaca means.
Mort, it's time for us to hear from you. Mort Chambers is one of Alan's oldest friends. Mort began teaching at UCLA back in 1958. He may have, I believe he did, give Alan the impetus to go to graduate school in classics. And this somehow stemmed from common service in the Army, which perhaps Mort will explain to us. Thank you, Mort.
Dear friends, we came here because of an unhappy, unfortunate thing that happened a year or so ago, and yet with good reason has this gathering been called a celebration, because we have a lot to celebrate when we think of Alan's life and what he gave us over the years and what we got out of the relationship. I would like to remind you of how he and I met and became acquainted with one another. We were in a program run by the U.S. Army during the war in the Army Reserve, where young men were brought in at age 17 to study engineering, the idea being that after the war was over, skills like this would be needed. And so we joined this program individually and separately. I didn't know he was there until we did happen to meet. We were stationed at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to learn engineering. Nothing could seem farther from my ability than to talk about engineering, but that's what I was made to do. And early in the program, we were being given a talk about how to maintain our equipment by a young man who was in the program. He was a brilliant student. He had been the #1 student in a class of, I think, 7,000 students at Lane Technical High School in Chicago. So he had some mental powers. And he was explaining to us how we should make our beds in the morning so that they would look good. And he said, and be sure as you work on your beds that the blanket covering it is kept taut. And at this misuse and butchering of the word taut, Alan and I looked at each other, caught one another's eyes, and later on we mentioned that this man had not used the right English. And yet this glance between us was our first meeting and communication of any kind. this little bit of a glance. And so we continued this relationship. We had both studied Latin, and a couple of days after this meeting I told you about, I heard him talking to his parents on the telephone, and he said, "And I've met someone who can quote Virgil at length in Latin." And we had both studied Latin, as I said, and this awakened our interest in classical studies with one another. And over the years, we became classmates at Harvard. As Alan entered Harvard in graduate school, I think I was already there, and I suggested he should join us, which he did. And we both studied under Sterling Dow, who has been mentioned today. We were never exactly parallel in tempo because Alan had gone into business after he got his BA degree. He worked for an insurance company, and he told me that his duty was to be a claims adjuster. Now, some of you may know what this means. He explained it in this way: "Alan, these kids need crutches. See that they don't get them." It will surprise you to know that when he applied to graduate school at Harvard, following my advice, I was already there were some people who did not care to have him admitted to graduate school. How could this be? Because he had gone into business and had spent 3 or 4 years in this profession that I just mentioned. And some people thought that he didn't have the dedication to scholarship that would justify his joining graduate school. There was, however, a professor at Harvard, maybe not terribly widely remembered today, Peter Elder. J.P. Elder was actually his name. He became dean of the Harvard Graduate School. And he told me that in discussing the admission of Alan with his colleagues, he said, "I don't care what this man has done before," that is, we already discussed that, "but I think he will be a good graduate student." And so he was admitted to Harvard on the recommendation of Peter Elder. And we know that this application was successful and that Alan became the outstanding study of the law courts and a number of other technical subjects within Greek history. His accomplishments in literature have already been discussed, and in every way, he was an outstanding man. Toward the end of his career, and I will skip over many years in the interest of time, we went to dinner at the APA convention. I think it was in Philadelphia, and Alan and I had the habit, Michigan dialect was what we spoke. We were both from Michigan. If you took someone to dinner, he would say, "Oh, you're the big butter and egg man, are you?" This was Michigan dialect because in Michigan, butter and eggs are big parts of the economy. So either Alan or I would assume the role of the butter and egg man and invite someone to dinner, be it just a drink or a glass of beer or whatever. That was not our last meeting, however, but it was at the APA. And it's an example of the memories that I cherish. And when we all know that sometimes during our life we need good memories, we have other not so good memories pressing in on us. And when I think of Alan and think of some of the great times we had playing tennis, playing squash, doing other things together, he told his friends at this meeting, this dinner that he gave as the big butter and egg man, he said how long we had known each other. And he concluded the story with these words, "And never a cross word." Thank you for listening to me.
It's our pleasure to listen to John Camp right now. I'm sure we all know John as the director of the excavations at the Agora in Athens for the last, since 1994. You do the math. Thank you.
Everybody has said pretty much everything that needs to be said about Alan, so I'll just say them quickly again. Alan was a man of words, and once spent much of his time puzzling out inscriptions, either on clay pots or on stone, puzzling out what Thucydides meant or said, explaining a joke of Aristophanes, analyzing how the speakers worked in the law courts, and then, of course, working in greater detail with his own translations of the poems of Cavafy, and then his own poems. When he ran out of words, he wrote a book about gestures, where the missing word would be supplied by a shrug or a wave of the hand or something like that. But Alan was very much about communication. I tried to think of one word that explains Alan, and I think that word has to be sharing. The most generous person most of us know. His life was full of family. It was full of colleagues here at Brown, excuse me, who together created one of the great classics departments in the country. His life was full of friends, students, scholarship and travel, reading and writing. I don't know how many of you went to his house, but you could look in every room and you would not find a television set. And Alan shared this rich and varied life with everyone, presumably in this room and much farther afield. I think in a way, it doesn't work these days because everybody has modern communications, but I think of all of us as part of a great big club, not a very exclusive club, a very inclusive club that we could call the Friends of Al. And all of us, I think, are members of that club. Its impact is clear when you look at this group here. People have come from the West Coast, they have come from Greece, and they have come from the United Kingdom just to spend a couple of hours remembering and celebrating Alan's life. I'm a relative new member of this club. We've just heard from the charter member, Mortimer Chambers, and several others who have a long association. I only knew Alan for 50 years. Once we knew each other, things were very good in the sense that we spent a lot of time together in Athens, on the beaches of New England, in boats off the coast of Turkey, and one particularly memorable year in the 1970s when he and his whole family lived in Corinth. Every weekend, I would go down and spend the weekend with the family. It was an amazing house they rented. It was designed by an architect we know, but we'll keep him nameless, because of the master bathroom, which had 3 separate doors leading into it. So it took 5 minutes to make sure that you were not going to be disturbed by other members of the household securing the room. But in any case, it was a time when we would go out and Violetta, their old friend, would show us, you would call them weeds, but we called it horta. She would tell us which greens to pick and to eat and which ones to leave in the ground. We did not have a similar guide for mushrooms, so we would pick them with great enthusiasm, and usually we didn't dare to eat them, but we did collect them, and we climbed, I think, not by design, but just by circumstance, pretty much every mountain in the Argolid and in the Corinthia, and all the kids came with us. Last week, on Sunday, I was coming down from Albany on the train. I got up early to New York City. I got up early, so I skipped breakfast, assuming I would eat something in the cafe car. And it turns out there is no cafe car on the train from Albany to New York City. So I arrived at the Harvard Club at about 1:30, kind of grumpy and really hungry. And the man at the front desk checking me in provided the welcome news that there was a brunch being served until 2:30. So I went in, and there was a really magnificent brunch. There were people making omelets, there was clam chowder, there were lamb chops, there was comfort food, there was rice pudding, there was everything you could think of. There was a huge table of shellfish and regular old fish. And so I, as I always do, ate much too fast and finished the meal very quickly, and then was sitting there thinking, isn't it sad that I can't eat anymore, but I'm just too full and I ate too fast. And then into my head came, gee, I wish Alan had been here to share it with me. And if he had been, he would have taken all the pleasure in the world, taken his time to appreciate the food, the drink, and whatever company he was with. Alan did not rush his way through life, and that is why it was so very, very rich. Thank you very much.
Is that okay? I miss my father today probably more than since his passing, because you've created such a vivid picture of him. I feel like he's kind of here. It's remarkable. Thank you for everything you said. The first poem I ever heard my dad read was called Looking Ahead. It was about our old dog, Jason. It was, old dog, silvery muzzle, lifts his head when I put on my coat. Heaven with him, heaven for him is an endless walk with me. So Jason is in his heaven now, finally, which is nice because he was a good dog and he deserves that. But Dad is not in his heaven, not yet. Everyone in this room knows, everyone who has ever seen a photo album of Dad's life knows, heaven for ALB is an endless walk with JEMB, Julie Marshall Bakehold, our mother. They met in 1953 in a boat on the Charles. She fell suddenly in love, apparently when he corrected her use of a word, which is not your typical successful gambit, but that's not what he was after. He was just really interested in having a conversation about the word, apparently, which was vagary versus vagary. Mom remembers this. She fell in love. She said he had this mind and he was interested in having a conversation about the word, and I've heard a few people mention his love of words there. It was on day one of Mom and Dad. Since then, 64 years, she has been his best friend and his muse and his wife, his adventurer and fellow traveler, his sometimes editor, sometimes co-worker, always the love of his life. If you look at any pictures, he's always looking at her like he just won the lottery. He can't even believe his good luck. It's every picture. He really... Julie. Alan was Alan because of Julie. In the last years of his life, he told her every day that she was his angel. And so Dad's not in his heaven yet, because you can't be in heaven without your best angel. I imagine he's in a very good place, though, with an ecstatic dog gambling around his feet, maybe on the old roads of Greece with his philosophers and poets and teachers and friends that have gone before him that he loved so much. While he waits his long wait for his heaven. Among the poets, I imagine Cavafy's walking along, and because Dad had such a singular voice when he read his poetry, so measured and clear, I thought I would read one of Cavafy's poems called Phones, which means voices, and it's a poem about remembering in our dreams and in our thoughts the voices of people that we have loved who are no longer around for whatever reason. Apologies to the Greek speakers. Ιδανικές φωνές και αγαπημένες εκείνων που πεθάνουν, ή εκείνον που είναι για μας χαμένοι σαν τους πεθαμένους. Κάποτε μες στα όνειρά μας ομιλούνε, κάποτε μες στην σκέψη τις ακούει το μυαλό. Και με τον ήχο των για μια στιγμή επιστρέψουν ήχοι από την πρώτη ποίηση της ζωής μας, σαν μουσική τη νύχτα μακρινή που σβήνει. Anybody that would like to hear Dad's beloved, remembered voice can hear it at the library on a video in a few minutes. My mom, are you wanting to speak or no? Mama?